All right, good morning. It's Bernard Nomberg, Nomberg Law Firm in Birmingham, Alabama. Hope everybody's doing well. We appreciate you spending some time with us this morning. We're talking about the Fair Pay to Play Act. Governor from California, Gavin Newsom, just recently signed in SB 206, which effectively is going to be a shot across the bow to the NCAA to get their act together by 2023. And I'm joined with four lawyers from different parts of the country I'm going to introduce. They are all lawyers, but we also have in common is everybody played collegiate sports at one point or another. And we're going to talk about the ramifications and what's going on with the new law that just got signed in. I first want to introduce John Meehan. John is from the St. Louis area. He played football at Drake, and he is now a sports agent. And John, welcome, and appreciate you having some time for us this morning.
I appreciate you having me on. It's good to be here, fellas.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've got Travis Christensen from Hurricane, Utah. Good morning, Travis.
Morning, Bernard. Glad to be here.
Good to see you. Travis played football at Center College in Kentucky, and we appreciate you having some time for us, Travis. Let's see, we got Mike Hollander from the St. Louis area. Mike played baseball at Missouri Western State University. Mike, I'm glad you got some time for us. We've already had some great conversation, and before I introduce my buddy Mo, thank you, Mike, for making some time for us, and I'm looking forward to hearing from a baseball perspective what you've got to say.
Thanks, Bernard.
And last but not least, my buddy Mo up in Huntsville, Alabama. Mo, Morris Lilienthal played football at Maryville College and also in Tennessee. And for those of you who don't know me, I played football at Vanderbilt in the SEC way back in the day. And we've all got not only the fact that we're lawyers, the fact that we love sports, whatever the sport may be. We see what's going on. It's now what appears to be or could be the Wild West after the governor has signed this law into being. Guys, we've had a great discussion leading up to going live, but I want to hear from you guys. Just anybody who's got something to share, let's just start talking again.
I mean, I can jump in first. I think we kind of discussed this a little bit earlier, but I think the huge thing that we're dealing with here with California passing this law is that now there's pressure on the NCAA, and the NCAA is going to have 3 years basically to try and figure out how they can institute this on their own terms and make this something that applies around the country. But from the agent perspective, I think there's so much difficulty that's going to be had in the next few years trying to figure out how this will actually go into effect. Because even if it is passed, across the country by either state legislations like California or with the NCAA actually changing their rules, it's a situation for agents where now currently maybe we recruit juniors and seniors who we know are about to come out or thinking about the NFL, and we recruit them to sign them once their playing career is done. But in this situation, there would be kids signing with agents during their college career and expecting marketing money and sponsorships, and I'll let everyone else chime in, but it's going to be difficult because it conflicts with all the player union rules. It conflicts with the NCAA rules. So it may be a situation currently right now where anyone who's licensed as an agent may not actually be able to sign any of these kids because we're bound by the NFLPA or the any of the other players unions. But these players may be signing with other marketing companies, so it opens the world up to the difficulty in recruiting kids who are probably, from the agent's perspective, everyone's looking younger most of the time. So in this situation with this new law, you could have seniors in college or seniors in high school who are getting recruited by agents so that we could sign them and work with them through their career in hopes that they eventually start and are able to generate some marketing revenue. So it's definitely changing the game quite a bit from my perspective.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead, Travis.
I was going to say, one of the biggest difficulties that I see is a lot of these big schools, yeah, they get their scholarship, they get their room and board and books and tuition, and sometimes a little stipend. The difficulty I see is that, at least at the big school level, like Mo, I played at a D3 school, and the big schools, it seems like these guys have a 40, 50, 60 hour a week job being an athlete, and they're a 15, 20 an hour a week student. And, where I played ball and I did football and track, we were 15, 20 hours a week as an athlete. and 40, 50, 60 hours a week as a student. And so I think that in a way, the big schools at least, what is pushing this is the incredible time demands put on these kids that, they can't even go get a job flipping burgers at the local McDonald's like I could playing at a small school. So that I think is really a crux of all of this is just these kids are trying to have clothes on their backs, maybe, all that kind of stuff, but they can't because they're so limited in the big school world as to what they can make. So I see why that pushes there is these schools make huge amounts of money. And, it'd be nice if everybody was in the D3 world where we were a student first and then an athlete instead of the other way around at the big schools.
Mike, from a baseball perspective, you put in as many hours playing the level that you did as they do on any other level. And it's a year-round commitment now for any sport that you play on an NCAA level. What issues did you see with your teammates or yourself whether you're on partial scholarship or no scholarship or complete? And I know there's real limits with baseball programs.
Yep.
Particularly at less than, not less than, but if you're on D2 or D3. What issues did you and your teammates have at that time you were going through this when you knew that 40, 50, 60 hours a week, you're doing your craft as well as trying to study and stay in school?
Right. Yeah, at the time it was kind of one of those things where you knew what you were getting yourself into in my position, and it was that's just the way it was type deal. I did have multiple teammates that held jobs outside of, not even like work study type jobs, but actual, they'd go to practice and they'd be working at a restaurant or something at night. And I know that I couldn't have done that with the amount of time that I was putting into other things, but having to do that, that's pulling you in a lot of different directions, and it's not a way for everybody to be successful. That's for sure. I don't really see things changing too much at the Division II level, especially with baseball, though, with this rule change possibly happening, because like we talked about before, I mean, a lot of this image and likeness stuff is really only going to affect the guys that are big time players, it seems like, that are getting a lot of publicity. Now, maybe there'll be one or two guys on a small college program that would be able to capitalize off this. But as far as every single person on a roster, or even 25% of the roster being able to benefit from this, at least at the small college level, higher percentage at the Power 5 Division I level for sure. It'll be interesting to see actually how many people do benefit from a change like this.
I think
John, from a perspective, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say the one thing that we discussed that I think is important a little bit before we went live is that, while it seems like this would be the most beneficial to starters on major schools and people who, are probably bound for the NFL anyway, there's still in a lot of these major college towns or some of these bigger places like in Nebraska or in Iowa or some of these schools that don't have pro teams, if you're a starter on that team, you probably have a local profile, and you could be getting, whether it's sponsorships where you're getting some sort of free meals from a certain restaurant, all the way up to actually getting paid for autographs and your likeness and things like that. And I think there's a bigger benefit to the college players because this allows them to capitalize on the time when most of them are at the peak of their athletic careers. Many of these players are not actually going to go to the NFL. Most players are not going to the NFL. But if you're starting at an Alabama or at a Missouri or at a major school, even if you're the captain at a smaller school in the MAC conference or somewhere like that, you could be capitalizing on this because you don't know if you're going to make it to the NFL. And this may be the height of your popularity. And I mean, who are we to say that if someone could make $50,000 in a year just off of their image and likeness at a smaller Division I school, that's not worth it? So it's while this on its face may look like it's only going to benefit the guys who are guaranteed NFL draft picks, I think in the local market levels, anyone who is probably on the field and has a recognizable name in that local community could really benefit from here, because you're going to get kids that are helping their mom with their bills. You're going to get kids who they don't have enough meal vouchers or whatever it is at that particular school. And the other thing is none of these are uniform. Players at different schools get different amounts. So it's not that every college player gets X amount of money, and obviously the local markets may have something to do with that. But ultimately, this is an opportunity for kids who may not make it to the pros to at least be able to financially capitalize on their being a college standout football player. And I think that's a good thing in the long term.
Let me give you guys a quick example. An Alabama football player makes a great play and immediately goes from being recognized to holy smokes recognized. Then you see his jersey number in the bookstore and all over the state being sold at sporting goods stores. Then you see hundreds of his jersey in the stadium on game day or all around the campus. He's not getting a penny of that. What about those? Mo, you've been to Bama games recently, as have I. You will see thousands of fans in the stands wearing jerseys of current players going back 50 years. I still see Stabler and Namath and all of the Bama greats. And none of those people get any of that money. None of those players.
Well, John makes a great point. I hadn't really thought about that to kind of just piggyback real quick on his, because I may be a little on the other side than some of the other guys. But John makes a great point. I could see small businesses like our business. If we couldn't afford Tua to be our sponsor, but we could take a starter for a top tier program and ask him to be our sponsor that may be just a starting, secondary or something like that. So I could definitely see that. I guess where I'm concerned is the regulation of all this. How are you going to regulate this? And that's what I was talking about before we came live. Is how do you regulate in a lot of different perspectives? Take Bernard's perspective, right? A lot of times when they sell the jerseys, they don't put the names on it. So you could be number 16. Well, number 16 could be 5 different famous players from Alabama. I guess you're going to have to put the name on the jersey. But my point being is, how do you regulate the bigger universities, or even on a smaller D2 level? How would you regulate somebody who could be a good player from having a booster coming in and say, hey, we want to sign this kid to your likeness if you sign with X college? So John gets with the local Ford dealership or a national Ford dealership, and they're affiliated with Oregon, or Nike's affiliated with Oregon, or whoever's affiliated with Oregon. Say, how do you regulate that? And then to John's credit, how do you regulate it from an agent perspective with college kids? with high school kids coming up. So we've got a lot of moving parts here. And I think the other thing that we've got is you're going to create a big and equitable gap in the genders. I don't know how many in sports. We're really talking about mainly basketball, football, and maybe a few star baseball players, because most of your star baseball players don't go to college. They're going straight into the minor, AAA or AA, and then right into the majors. A few do. We've got some, but I'm just kind of saying there's going to be a huge gap between programs and women's and men's sports. And I'm all for paying these players something to help them, and maybe something for, the money they're earning that's being earned off their sweat, and trying to figure out how do you do that. And that's the tough part.
I think it's difficult because when you think about the entire situation of sports, and I know, with the women's national team doing really well, obviously in the World Cup, and the pay inequalities that exist amongst men and women's sports in a lot of levels. One of the sports that we work mainly with is mixed martial arts. So when you work with a lot of fighters, a guy like Floyd Mayweather, not one of my clients, but it's one of those situations where you're in a position where pay-per-view revenue is important. So just like how that translates, people ask, why are these people making more money than these people? Well, realistically, a lot of it comes down to what's the viewership, because when it comes to marketing, everything's about viewership. Today, if I do a sponsorship contract for a fighter or a football player, the number one thing they want to know is how many social media followers do they have, what are their impressions, what % of their following is regularly interacting with their page. So ultimately, there's going to be a gap, but it's all based on popularity. And the market kind of dictates the pay, and whoever is getting the most eyes on them for whatever reason is probably going to end up making more money. And I don't know how you really get around that. My wife is a college volleyball player, just like we were speaking about earlier. She was the career scoring leader at Drake University, and she worked on the weekends and at nights at a restaurant. So she was waiting tables while she was the best player on the D1 volleyball team because, and I know that they had good amounts of support. And I watched thanks to her, I watched all the women's volleyball tournaments and everything like that. But there's a market out there, and it's just that, unfortunately, right now, before this law passed and before the NCAA makes big changes, the only people who can benefit financially is the team, whereas these players should have the right to their own likeness. Why should teams be able to make millions of dollars every year and cap these players on, oh, you just get this stipend, you just get this amount of money every month? And I think that's kind of what they're trying to combat here.
Right now, California is the only state that has actually passed laws, but I recently read that 6 or 7 other states have bills that are being introduced. And so I think this is going to start snowballing and heading that way when they see that California is now paving the way. But the other thing I wanted to bring up, Travis, I don't know if you've seen this. I don't remember if we've talked about this yet. Of course, the commissioners of the Power 5 conferences are coming out and publicly saying that they're not necessarily for this, and I understand why. But compare and contrast that with the LeBrons and the Richard Shermans and many other former collegiate athletes who've already taken to social media saying, now it's time. It's finally time for this to happen. It really is such a dynamic difference.
Well, I think because they struggled. I mean, they were playing college ball. They were doing well. I mean, LeBron just went straight from high school to the NBA and kind of skipped that whole game because I think he, from a marketing perspective and from a business perspective, was a really shrewd young man in that he jumped right into where he could get those big endorsement deals. And in a way, there's some risk, I think, to the colleges if they don't adopt something to let some kids make a little more money out of their name, image, and likeness of more LeBron Jameses happening in the world, of more guys who go straight from high school into the pros. And you can almost see, and I'm surprised it hasn't happened in a way, is the other professional sports team leagues, the NBA and the NFL, and things adopting more of the baseball model of having some, under minor leagues, if you will. And the NFL's got it a little bit with NFL Europe and some of the things they've been doing, but you could really, if colleges don't do something, some of the star athletes, you may have not one and dones like Kentucky seems to have mastered as an example, but none and dones, more LeBrons, these high school kids, guys like John saying, why go to college? You can go make millions right now from Nike and Reebok and Adidas and your contract with your team and just go and skip the college game altogether. And so, in basketball, I just think I went to College of Kentucky. I mean, there's no group of guys more worshipped on this earth than the starting 5 in the University of Kentucky basketball. I mean, those guys could be millionaires by the time they're out of college if they, and it's crazy. And that's just from local endorsements, the car dealerships and whatnot there. And so this can really have some crazy things going on. And I think that, the NCAA and the conferences in the states, it could be really scary in the Wild West, regulatory issues and everything else. And potentially, if the NCAA doesn't do something, I can actually see kind of the end of the big time sports programs and a greater proliferation of pro sports, of more LeBron James is happening. I'm just going to skip college altogether.
Well, I think Travis brings up, I was just saying real quick, Travis brings up a great point, and I see it on both ends of the spectrum. First, so you take just this year, Zion Williamson, I think is his name, the great player at Duke. He might have stayed another year or two to develop his craft under Coach K if he could be making humongous 8-figure, endorsement deals. Because he doesn't need to go to the NBA just yet to make that money to do. He'd stay. So I can see the upper level, college basketball, for example, actually being better. But where I can see a negative impact is, for example, we follow a Division II program here at University of Alabama Huntsville, and I was speaking with their coach a few weeks ago, and he said one of the problems that they have, and they're ranked preseason number 9 in Division II this year, is that they get kids who are fringe Division I kids that they are going to go to VMI or a mid-major Division I team, sit on the bench, but they want to be able to put on Facebook or not Facebook if they're kids, Instagram or Snapchat, and say that they're D1, they signed a D1 level scholarship, as opposed to coming a top tier D2 team. But if you have, we've got to be careful with this, because then you're going to have kids that would go be stars at D2 or 1AA in football. They might want that Division I level scholarship and go to those programs, just thinking they may have a better endorsement deal out there to make a little more cash on the front end, when they might actually be better served from an athletic standpoint and academic, maybe at the D2 or 1AA level.
Mo, I agree with you. Let me throw this to Mike, because maybe, Mike, you can resonate with this or relate to this. The Vanderbilt baseball program, I went to Vanderbilt. That's I follow the Vandy boys, and it's easy to do so when you're winning national championships.
The football program there some days.
Easy. All right, let's look at Kumar Rocker, fabulous pitcher. Father Tracy Rocker played in the pros and is now a defensive coach, I believe, at the University of over in Knoxville. I don't mention their name. Look at the Al. I think it's Jack Leiter. His dad, Al Leiter, played in the pros for many years.
Yep.
Those two pitchers are now at Vanderbilt, and the only reason why they didn't go straight from high school into being drafted in one of the top probably 5 draft picks in the first round, when they both came out respectively in the last 2 years, is because both of their fathers played professional sports. Their financial situations, I'm assuming, are a whole lot different than 99% of those athletes who feel that tug. I want to provide for my family right now. We do not have the resources. I'm going to the pros. But for every Garnett or Kobe or LeBron who does make it straight from high school into the pros, how many hundreds, if not thousands, of kids you never hear from again because they get hurt? They don't save their money. They don't make it in the pros. And I bet you see that in the baseball standpoint quite a bit. Talk to us a little bit about what you've seen.
Yeah, within the baseball world is so much different, and John, you can chime in whenever, than like basketball and even football, because of the way the rules are, where if you go out of high school, you go, but if you go to college, you're there for 3 years. So it's that time frame really makes you sit down and think a lot more. And of course, in basketball, you can't go right away right now. So there's no decision to make. And in baseball, a lot of times it comes down to what their signing bonus offers are if they did get drafted. I mean, it literally comes down to just a financial situation. And like you said, if your family is already set financially, like the two families you talked about with Kumar Rocker and then Al Leiter's son, if finances aren't an issue, a lot of times, I mean, I think the better option for families is to go and play in college. If you look at the success rate in a draft, the MLB draft these days, a lot of times, if you look at the numbers, percentage-wise, college guys seem to make it up to the MLB more than a guy drafted straight out of high school, especially if we're talking about later rounds. A college guy getting taken after the 10th round or something, they have more of a pedigree to be able to make it through. I don't know how much this change like this would affect those type of situations, though, because like we talked about, how much is this going to affect Division I baseball player? We're talking about a few players possibly. One thing I did want to chime in on is the opportunity that is this of players not even getting endorsement deals, but just money from boosters. Does this open the door up? Just you're just going to be able to get money just from somebody, because they want you to go to a school, not even getting an endorsement deal. You're just getting money to go here. Because I think we've been talking all about endorsement deals with this. But I think the real Pandora's box is now you're just going to be able to have the opportunity possibly to just get paid. And so the regulations with that would be very interesting to see how NCAA would address that.
I think it's interesting because to some extent you could get in a situation where maybe teams do have a certain amount of percent revenue that they need to be paying to players based on their marketing revenue, so that it is spread out amongst the players or something like that. We're seeing right now there's litigation against the UFC, and a lot of the issues that they're talking about is the actual profit share and how much is going to the athletes of what the UFC makes every year. And that could be something here. But another important topic I wanted to touch on that you guys mentioned is, in football, we're seeing more and more juniors coming out and declaring for the draft, despite the fact that they then lose their eligibility. How many of these kids would stay in college an extra year if they knew that they could make some kind of money? It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be the $500K that, minimum contract or whatever that they get in the NFL. But if they weren't so dependent on, hey, my risk of injury is always high because it's football. I had a great junior year. Maybe I can come out this year and be a mid-rounder, whereas next year, if all the cards align, I could be a first-rounder. Well, this opens up the door to allow more players to possibly stay in college because they know that they can at least provide some sort of they're getting some sort of financial benefit to their name, and they're not trying to right now, everyone's rolling the dice and gambling, hoping that they can make it to the NFL and make a living. And the amount of guys that come out as juniors and don't get drafted or don't ever make a team or get cut because they were drafted late and they should have probably developed another year or two, that's a huge problem that I think could be rectified if this is done correctly, because they'd at least be able to make, and I mean, we're all assuming, there'd be guys making millions, but I mean, think about the guy who's making $50,000. That's not bad money for a college kid who you don't know what their background is, but they wouldn't have the issues that they're having, and they wouldn't be so hard-pressed to take their shot because they think that, the risk of injury at their senior year is too high, their numbers are trending upwards, and they're jumping ship to the pros because that's the only shot they have to really make that kind of money in their life. So I think that this is a good thing long-term when you consider some of those ramifications.
John, I got a follow-up question, but I want to welcome those who are watching us from different parts of the country. Don McClure in Houston, buddy of ours, my dad in Gulf Shores, Mitch Jackson in California, who's got some questions I'm going to throw to you guys in a minute, Nicole Abood, Mary Morgan, and several others. Thank you guys for your comments, your questions. If you're watching us live, or even if you watch us later on, we'll welcome all of your comments. We're talking about Fair Pay to Play Act that was just signed into law into California. Several other states are considering doing similar types of laws in their state. It is a shot across the bow to the NCAA saying you've got until 2023 to get into the modern age, so to speak. So a lot of things we're talking about now, we'll still be talking about this 6 months and 2 years from now. But Mitch's question or comments were for the panel. It seems to Mitch that if you put the athlete's best interests first and do what's right, everything else should fall into place. And I agree in theory, but how are they going to get there? And I guess that's what the next 3 years are going to be about. And hopefully, well, not hopefully, the schools in the NCAA will be just fine. Nobody's going to stop coming to the games just because they've changed the way that some of the dynamics about how athletes may be compensated now. But here's my question, John. I want to get back to about your comment. I think I know because I don't do any agency work, so that's why I'm asking you. In the NBA, if a kid who is an undergraduate and is not a senior, but maybe a third-year player, can't they go and hire an agent just to test the waters to see where their status may be from a draft standpoint? Kind of explain that the way the NBA works. Does the NFL have anything similar to that?
Yeah, so I represent mostly fighters and NFL players. So we don't actually represent any basketball players, but I have a good friend who is a basketball agent. And essentially what the NCAA did was they made new rules last year where technically a player could sign with an agent, come out, and I believe even maybe go through the draft process up to a certain point and decide they want to come back to school, and their eligibility is not then waived. So it's a situation where you could have players sign with a different agent every offseason just to test the waters and see where their stock is. have these agents pay for their training, have them pay for their housing and all of that, and they could still come back to school, which really is in the best interest of the player because that's them. They have the ability to go pro, get as far as they want with that, and say, no, I can still go back to school because I see that this isn't going the right direction. But it really screws agents over because these agents, you could have signed a guy who's a freshman who could get drafted, and if he decides to come back to school, there's nothing stopping him from firing you, hiring a different agent, and literally just agent shopping for 4 years to get as much money as he can, including signing bonuses, marketing bonuses, all those other things. And when they released that, I know a lot of people were pretty upset because it really created more confusion than it did help with anything. And maybe it's to the best. Maybe it's helping the players in some way because, yeah, who wouldn't want to be able to go through the process for free, see where you stand, and then go back and retract everything? But it really changes the game from the agent's perspective because, you could have, like I said, a player who has 4 different agents over 4 years and then finally comes out when they're supposed to. And, it kind of, from the agent perspective, I hate that. It definitely would not be, it almost wouldn't be worth even, it would change the game so much that it wouldn't be worth even trying to deal with some of these players just because that option's always there.
Do you guys think now, Mo, Travis, all you guys, do you think now that this is happening, it's going to lead to federal laws that are going to regulate the NCAA? It's going to make anybody who's an agent, anyone who deals with these athletes, have to comply with federal law, whatever it may be, in order to regulate, that's a terrible word, but to monitor, to make sure that, at least in some part, that it's all done above board to the best that it can be watched and to be followed.
Well, somebody's going to have to look over this, Bernard, and trying to get your hands around it. We've been talking for 30 minutes, and I bet we've listed 10 or 15 things that are going to be new areas to look out for. And one of the things I'm sitting here thinking about, so basically what we're talking about the whole last half hour is now NCAA athletes can be paid for endorsements, likeness, those kinds of things, right? So let's move down further. What about high school kids? And you think I'm kidding, but how many times are we seeing, when we look at the recruiting services, I'm seeing stuff on AL.com about Alabama looking at kids who are sophomores now, and we see all these players. Who's the next LeBron as a 9th or 10th grader out there at some school? What prevents them from, no different than a child actor, what prevents them from hiring an agent to go ahead and start giving those endorsement deals? And then that would not, under this law, that would not usurp their right to be eligible for the NCAA. We got to be careful with this and do, because we're opening up a Pandora's box here. But I think it needs to be open. John's made a lot of great points, and everybody else has. But it's just a question of how do you regulate it, and and is it, do you do it on each individual basis? Maybe market share of regulating, coming in and saying, okay, we're going to open this up, and that would help with some of the inequalities in some of the sports, and maybe with men's and women's sports, that these programs are being able to just provide each of them some of the money from the profits that these programs are making. I'm not sure how to regulate it, Bernard, but it's definitely going to have to be, because, look at now how many NCAA, every 5 minutes you turn around, there's an NCAA investigation or somebody's being put on probation for something. This is going to make that even worse.
I mean, it's
Name a
crazy
school
to think
that
about
has. Go ahead,
So
John.
one point I wanted to bring up that I think has gotten, ultimately why we're doing this, or why people have been pushing for this for so long, in my opinion, is because think about any other college student. Any college student can go run and monetize a YouTube page as long as they're not an athlete. Any college student who's a musician can go out here and broadcast everything they want. They can put out CDs, albums, do whatever. I mean, it almost penalizes you to be a college athlete in financial terms, because like we were mentioning earlier, with jobs, I mean, you don't have time to go get a job, but someone else could be working. You don't have time. If you're an artist, you can sell whatever you want. You can have an e-commerce site as a college student, as a high school student, and get financial benefit from that. The only way that you're not allowed to monetize your skills is if you're a college athlete. And ultimately that's, how we actually go about it, and how the NCAA and all these separate states end up coming to any sort of agreement. That's going to be key, but we're all trying to, and I say we, but obviously I'm not a party to it, but like the whole goal with this is to allow players who are required to go through all this academics. I mean, there's players that are NFL caliber that can't keep their grades up, so they can't play football because they're not good at school. You know what I mean? Like, that's like you want to be an electrician, you can go to electrician school. That's like going to practice as a football player. But you have to play the game to be able to play, meaning play the academic game even to get into the NFL because of how the system's going. So I think it's, to some extent, we're trying to protect players because this is such a small percent of the population that actually makes it. And there's so many hoops you have to jump through that it's almost unfair and almost diminishes the value of it because, you know, they are the only college students unable to make any money outside of, you know, if you have a full academic scholarship, you can still go have a job somewhere. You know, the only people that are, you know, getting the short end of the stick here are the athletes.
John, when you were at Drake, how many in the I assume you played the 4 years you were in school, and you had hundreds of teammates. How many made it professionally in that sport?
Zero. Drake has had one guy drafted in the last 10 years, and I think they have another kid this year who could, but essentially zero.
Mo, same question for you. D3 football, Maryville, how many made it into the pros? Same question for you, Travis and Mike.
None.
Travis?
I had our starting tailback played about 3 years in NFL Europe. That's the only guy. And then after me, a few years, we actually had our kicker was the starting kicker for the Buffalo Bills. Last name was Gay. He's been out for a couple years, but 3 or 4 years he was the kickoff specialist for the Bills. An amazing kicker, but that's a very rare thing outside of the Power Five and some of the better other Tier 1 D1 programs.
Mike,
So,
D2 baseball.
We had our shortstop was drafted and our third baseman was drafted. Both no longer playing. One is still coaching in the Indians organization. I went to junior college previously, and I think I've still got one buddy that's still playing in the minors now. So I was with 3 guys.
And in the 4 years I was at Vanderbilt, we had a handful of guys who had just some minor success in the NFL, maybe 4 or 5 guys total. So from the 5 of us, probably collectively 700 to 1,000 total teammates, if you add it all up, maybe 10 reached the pinnacle of their sport. And that's just a very small just a very small example here. Guys, we could sit here and talk about all of this for the next 2 hours. I wish I could. Before we close out, and I want to thank you guys for your time, your expertise, your passion, your experience in talking about these issues that it's going to be interesting over the next couple of years. And I want to revisit this with this group maybe a year from now and see what's evolved since then and see if your opinions have changed, because there are probably topics we have not touched on today that others will eventually get to and make them into the public. I'd love to see if the federal government's going to be involved in somehow. The NCAA is so enormous, and so many billions of dollars are part of this institution, and hundreds of thousands of people. How many people sit in the stadiums on Saturdays during the college football season around the country? Millions. It's too important and too big of an institution not to be, updated so that everyone can figure out a system that works. And before we close out, I want to give you guys each an opportunity to share a last thought or two, if you have anything you want to share before we conclude for today.
I'll jump in. I think, just ultimately, I think that this play by California was smart. And I think, obviously being the home of more residents than any other state, and having the, LA and everything else out there where most of the agent activity takes place, this was a good nudge for the NCAA. I don't think that they intended to do this to try and set the standard. I think they did this to push the NCAA to actually collectively, along with states possibly, come to some sort of agreement and ratify their rules to the modern age. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a positive move in the right direction. It's something that people have been talking about for a while, and I think it's a good thing overall. Really, we'll see what type of regulations they put into, and the point that Morris made about even trickling down into the high school level. I mean, these kids are playing on ESPN high school games once a week. What's kind of box is going to be opened up here, and how they're going to try and keep everything under wraps will be interesting to see.
No, I agree. Great discussion, Bernard. Thanks for putting this together. We've thrown a bunch of darts against the wall. Trying to put your hands around it's going to be a difficult thing. I think at the end of the day, there's no doubt that these kids are out there and putting it all on the line. A lot of health issues that we don't even know about, and I think they deserve to be compensated in some way for their likeness and their efforts. Trying to do that on an equitable, fair manner and try to keep somewhat of a level playing field is going to be difficult in regulating it. But it's got to, just because it's difficult doesn't mean you don't need to do it.
And I'm just wishing that I'd have been able to make a little money when I was in high school as a starting strong safety of my high school team, and then in college getting a deal with the local Shake Shack to give me a milkshake a day after practice. So it'll be an interesting thing, really, to see what happens with this thing. But certainly it could be very beneficial for some of these kids. And it'll also be, I think, interesting what this might do. We haven't talked about this, to coaches' pay. I think I saw that Saban's like at 8.7. Well, if these local places can capitalize on giving money to these kids, are these coaches going to make as much money as they are, or is it going to maybe spread the wealth a little bit? Just there's a lot that can happen still. So I am glad that California kind of got the ball rolling seriously and put a kind of a deadline, but I think it's out there far enough for a solution to be found.
Well, I think one thing we can agree upon is that we're not going to solve it all here today. So I do want to revisit this with you guys. I want to thank each of you, Mike Hollander in the St. Louis area, Morris Lilienthal in Huntsville, Travis Christensen in Utah, and John Meehan in the St. Louis area. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time, your expertise, and sharing your thoughts. This will conclude us for now, but we will revisit this sometime next year and see where we are. Signing off for now. Hope you guys have a great weekend. Hope your sports teams win, and we'll see you another time. Be well.
Thanks a lot, fellas.
Thanks for having us, Bernard.